Welcome to a post-election edition of Latino Loud podcast. I'm Joe Garcia, here, Executive Director of Chicanos por la Causa Action Fund. We oversaw the Latino Loud nonpartisan Get Out the Vote effort here in Arizona and Nevada and all points in the Southwest. So this is a post-election edition, so have a couple of special guests here. To my right is Danny Ortega, a civil rights attorney and also a board member of the CPLC Action Fund. And also to my further right is DJ Quinlan, DJ of Radar Strategies. DJ is a numbers cruncher, but not only that, he can figure out what all the numbers are. He can connect the dots. So we're going to do kind of a post-mortem look at the elections, where Latinos are today, as opposed to prior to this election, and where they're going tomorrow, and what does the Latino vote mean for elections moving forward.
Latino Loud!
Brought to you by Si Se Vota, Chicanos por la Causa Action Fund. With Danny, you've seen a lot of the results. Latinos have mixed emotions about some of these results, but there is no doubt that the Latino vote and even the Latino non-vote somewhat had played a part in election outcomes. Anything that surprised you? Are you disappointed? Is there some optimism? Where are you with the post-election?
Well, I have all of those emotions, quite frankly, in large part because, you had one side preaching to the choir about the economy, about border security, and the other side doing the same. But the message, I think, was the simplest and the most emotional of all came from the winners. The folks who reached folks about what was important to them. The surprise clearly to me, after having been through so many elections over the years, was the amount of Latino vote that went into what we would consider the Republican side of the aisle. I'm not promoting one or the other, but Republican side of the aisle, given the Secure the Border Act, which was clearly, in my opinion, anti-Latino. They see it as anti-immigration. They kind of go well together because we can both be identified as immigrants. And so, but I think that we need to ease up a little bit on those who went in that direction, because there was more on the ballot than immigration. There was the presidency, there was the economy, there was the Congress, there was reproductive rights, there was religious beliefs. All kinds of things involved here, that if you took the Latino community and try to segment it in some way, it could probably fill all of those categories. And I think that on the one hand, as disappointed as I am at the numbers of Latinos that voted on the Republican side of the aisle, it also is kind of encouraging, right, that they have to be reached. Somebody has to talk to them. Candidates have to pay attention. That if they want those votes, they can't count them in their pockets before they get to the polls. That's number one. And number two, I think at the end of the day, we, like every other group that's a part of this country, have identified differently this time than we did in the past. And I think it's got to do with economics. And so clearly I'm disappointed. Clearly I wish the Latino vote had gone another direction, especially when you think about the Secure the Border Act. But there was a bright side. We have in the state of Arizona the first Latino to be elected to the U.S. Senate. How you balance, and I'm sure we're going to get into that, how you balance the Trump vote versus the U.S. Senate vote, right? In this situation with Ruben Gallego is of interest to me because, it's kind of a mixed bag. But at the end of the day, I wish things had turned out differently, but now we got to look forward to see how it is we can reach more voters, reach the voters that we do have, and in some way or fashion, show that we're capable of seeing both sides.
Yeah, and Latino Loud is a nonpartisan get out the vote effort, voter engagement, voter education, and the whole idea was letting people know that we've told the candidates in the campaigns, we will get more Latino voters to the polls. It's up to you to win their vote. And, we stand by that. We truly are nonpartisan. So if we can get more Latinos involved, we think that where decisions are being made, if Latinos are at that table, hopefully Latino issues will be addressed regardless of party.
And amongst family, we clearly saw the distinction between who was on our side and who wasn't within my own family, right? And my message to my brothers and sisters in particular was that, yes, we have a lot of our family who were very pro-Trump, very pro-Carrie Lake, and that is not any reason to disavow them or to abandon them. I think that we need to embrace them just the way we've always done, because we have more in common than we do not have in common politically. And that may sound like a moderate voice that you usually don't hear from Danny Ortega, but I analyzed it from a family standpoint, that we have to keep families together, and we're going to differ. And we did so this time, and we're going to do our darndest within our family to stay together.
Yeah, I've always found it interesting how the election is always in the same month as Thanksgiving. So, you have to kind of get over the hurt or the gloating or whatever it may be in a couple of weeks, because then Thanksgiving at the table are various people with various viewpoints. So we'll see how that goes. DJ, kind of interested in the numbers. I know you're going to share some of them, but as Danny mentioned, the vote was all over the place for the Latinos, and maybe that's a good thing. But some of them seemed like you really couldn't connect the dots because they seemed like they couldn't be connected. There was a disconnect. Yeah. But maybe that's kind of the politics we live in now, that it isn't always straight R's or straight D's. As you know, more than a third of the registered voters are independents or no party alignment there. So, I mean, is this a sign of where we're moving forward, where both parties now got to look at the Latino community a little bit differently?
Well, I certainly hope that's where we're getting to, because I think, we say over and over again that the Latino community is not a monolith, but then we continue to then talk about them as if they are a monolith. And I think if this election cycle demonstrates anything, Latino voters have the same concerns that all voters have, and they kind of need to be treated as a persuasion voting group, because as the economy is a concern for voters, Latinos are willing to cast votes for either political party and who they think are going to be on their side. Now, when we look at the pieces of data that we have right now, and here in Arizona, we're still counting ballots. There's probably about 130,000 ballots statewide that have not been tabulated yet. So we're still awaiting some data, but we have a lot of pieces of information already to kind of start to look at how the Latino community voted, how they turned out and voted. And I guess if we're looking for silver linings in this election cycle, the Latino vote continues to turn out very strongly in the state. We're seeing an uptick in support or turnout for voting across the board throughout the state. We don't have final numbers yet, but we can clearly project the Latinos are going to make up over 600,000 of the 3.5 million votes in the state. That's a really clear trend line, in which case it will likely be a numerical record. We'll see if it will turn out to be a percentage record for the turnout. But, Democratic-leaning Latinos, Republican-leaning Latinos, kind of more swing-voting Latinos, they all turned out in record numbers, and this was a high turnout election, and that's a good thing when Latinos have more of their say in the electorate. We can start to look at like some of the exit polls and stuff whenever you want to, but I think one thing that is clear across the board and is not a trend that is secluded to Latinos is former President Trump, soon to be President again Trump, overperformed across almost every demographic group, including Latinos. There's a lot of evidence that we've seen so far when we look at precinct analysis and other things of actual voting results that more than 60% of Arizona Latinos voted for Vice President Harris in the election, but it's very clear that it is a smaller percentage than President Biden got in 2020.
Yeah, and what was interesting is I know we've heard a lot of analysis talking about Latino men, and but the CNN exit polls were saying that, and for Arizona at least, there was no gender gap difference. It was, I think it was 44. What did I say? 44 for Trump.
Yeah, so when you look at the presidential race, according to the CNN exit polls, and I would add the caveat, exit polls are notoriously bad for Latino voters. I don't know if it's
We don't talk to them.
stranger with the clipboard effect, but that's why we look at a number of measurements to kind of gauge where Latino support was in various races, and I can talk about a few of those afterwards. But when we look at just the CNN exit polls, Latino men supported, in Arizona specifically, supported Vice President Harris 55% to 41%. Latinas supported Vice President Harris at 55% as well. So we didn't see that gender gap. I don't know that that necessarily means one didn't exist. I would suspect that Vice President Harris did slightly better with Latinas than Latinos, but I think that it's interesting given some of the discourse that's occurring. And, Danny, to your point about the U.S. Senate race, the exit poll suggested that Congressman Gallego, soon to be Senator Gallego, not surprisingly performed about 6 points better than the top of the ticket. And I think that could be a big part of the discourse about where Latinos went this year in terms of messaging, talking about the economy, and talking about other issues.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the congressman will be the first Latino from the state of Arizona to represent our state in the U.S. Senate. And that's a big, big move, because I think that Ruben Gallego was able to present himself not simply as the Latino candidate. So I think it is perhaps a maturation process taking place where voters are also looking at Latinos differently in more of a mainstream than as a novelty or as a separate entity. And that could be a start here, because obviously he won not just the Latino vote, but the non-Latino vote.
Well, the Ruben Gallego situation is really interesting, because on the one hand, there were times when I watched him and say, this Latino thing is going too far, right? Because he did use it in ways that most candidates wouldn't use it. And the reason why I think that didn't have a negative effect, because he was a veteran first. If you looked at his whole campaign, he was a veteran first, and that is big for Latinos. By the way, it's not the other way around. It's not Latino veteran. It's veteran first and Latino second. And so I think his campaign dealt with it in a way that I wouldn't have advised. That's why I lost a few races, right? But it was a very smart campaign that really centered in on his strengths. Veteran, Latino, his upbringing, his mother, his family, all of the things mixed together in a capirotada, right? That I think really was attractive to voters. And least but not least, all the help that he got from Carrie Lake. From a dislike standpoint, he couldn't have gotten a better opponent. She wasn't, those who loved her, and those who hated her. And so at the end of the day, I think that has to be going to the equation, because his story and his background against her anger was, I think, part of the equation also.
Yeah, interestingly enough, the political pundits were predicting a very close election, very narrow margins.
Yeah,
but
10,000 votes.
But in Ruben Gallego's election, they were thinking it could be high singles or maybe even double digits. But actually, it was very, very close. So, were you surprised that it was as close as it was? And were you surprised that the other margins of victory, largely for Republican candidates, including President Trump, was as large as it was?
Yeah, it was certainly surprising, I think, for most people, except for the most true believers kind of on the Republican side. I think what we've seen across the board throughout the country was the ground shifted in this election a little bit towards Republicans. And I think, there's a tremendous amount of discourse already going on. We're certainly going to all be doing a little bit of soul searching and analysis about, what happened. I think some of the early discourse that I tend to gravitate towards revolves around the economy. I mean, we sometimes forget that, over about a 2-year span, as we're coming out of the pandemic, prices increased about 20%, pretty much across the board for most Americans. And that was a big shock. I mean, oftentimes that's an amount of inflation that takes a decade or more to occur. And, it is something that is disproportionately felt by Latinos. And it is quite a shock to the system. That just creates an environment sometimes where we see the politics shift and the polls shift in a way that really can't be measured. So I think there's going to be a lot of analysis for sure, but I certainly was among the ones that were surprised by how far kind of rightward of a shift. That being said, I mean, we still live in a state that is split kind of right down the middle. Latinos are the key, if not one of the key persuasion group in Arizona, will continue to be key for winning statewide in Arizona. And, nationally, the popular vote looks like it's going to finish within 2 points, certainly, perhaps even less than a point. So as the rest of the votes are coming in. So, all this to say that, we still live in a very divided country. And, we're going to look and see how people are reacting to the economy over the next couple of years, because I certainly don't think that we are seeing any kind of major shift happening outside of the context of this election span.
Yeah, regarding the Latino vote, I mean, isn't that part of the problem, is that we put all Latinos in one bucket? We equate the Latino vote in Arizona and New Mexico and Texas the same as the Latino vote in Florida, or the same as the Latino vote in New York. So this oversimplification, which is done by the media and pollsters and so forth, isn't that part of the challenge, is to perhaps look at the Latino votes or voting regions differently?
Well, I think that I look at it I look at it from a cultural standpoint, and I look at it from a political standpoint, right? And I think you got different analysis on both sides, because I think Latinos generally, no matter which one you are, Cuban, Puerto Rican, Mexican American, the list goes on of who the Latino vote is, that we're all very, very culturally proud of our backgrounds, our language, and all those things. But politically, we're more like everybody else. We don't see the difference for some reason. Latinos who are in politics, we don't see the difference in a way that's significant, that somehow when you lay the culture aside, not behind, but lay in your analysis, you're forgetting that Latinos are about the economy more than anything else. Okay? And they're the ones affected the most, because those who make the less money still have to spend the same amount for food. I mean, just simple things. In my neighborhood, I used to buy a $5 hamburger. Now it's $10. I used to buy a $4 rule. There was a time when I paid a quarter for them, okay?
How old are you?
Yeah. But the point is that for those in the lower economic strata within our community, whether it's middle class, right, or somewhere in that area, prices have a significantly higher impact than they do for folks who are in the higher income brackets and who typically vote more in the higher income brackets. So this election has helped me to view the world in a more broader way. And I'll end with this on this comment. We have to stop being angry. We have to calm down. We have to analyze the Latino vote for what it was, come to reality about it. And for the next election, if you want the Latino vote, you have to look at what they want and look at what they're listening. And we just didn't pay enough attention to the economy and the moderation of their politics, which led them to the right rather than to the left.
Yeah. And to your point about, treating the community as a monolith, especially geographically, when you look at various states, Florida and South Texas have been highlighted a lot as having a pretty extreme rightward shift, in terms of their vote over the last couple election cycles. We haven't seen that as much happen in Arizona and, frankly, other states that have a more kind of Mexican-American dominant population. But, this election cycle, we certainly are seeing a shift, whether it's 5, 6, 7 points.
It's a lot.
In that direction. It's meaningful in a state that is, like I said, right down the middle. That's a meaningful shift, and we're seeing similar shifts across the board. One shift that I've seen in the Arizona data already in the 2024 election results that needs to be analyzed more, but it's a rural-urban divide. I've been looking at, we look at a lot of cross checks on the exit poll data because it's been so historically unreliable for measuring Latino voter sentiment. UCLA has a voter rights project, the University of California, and they look at precinct analysis in counties across the country, particularly at the Latino vote. They've already looked at Maricopa and Pima counties precinct analysis, looking at census data, looking at how Latinos actually voted, not survey research, but actually looking at election results in Latino dominant precincts. It's apparent by that data that in some areas, particularly in Central and South Phoenix, Latinos voted 70% for Harris over Trump, but across the board in those two counties, over 60%, which suggests a trend line that's more in line with the historical norm. But when you look at places that are closer to the border, South County, Yuma, Santa Cruz County, like we've seen actually more of an overperformance for Trump in those areas. So it kind of suggests that there might be a little bit of a rural-urban divide in that trend line that's happening. And that certainly makes sense in a South Texas context as well.
At the end of the day, have you looked at, or are you going to look at the numbers on where Latinos fell on 314?
Yeah,
do you have any
we
analysis
certainly
at
are.
all?
We haven't done much analysis of that
314 is the Secure the Border Act.
Yes.
Correct. Yeah, and so I think it's probably safe to say that Latinos will have supported it at the end of the day, just in our cursory analysis so far, a slight majority, certainly lower than the rest of the population, but it looks like broadly kind of every demographic group that you can kind of split in Arizona probably supported it by in the case of Latinos, by a narrow margin.
Well, the way it was presented was secure the border, that you were stopping illegal smuggling of fentanyl across the border. And who isn't against that? But the text, which is long and deep, goes well beyond those confines, basically, that turns local law enforcement officers into Border Patrol agents, looking for, at one point, the text actually included targeting DACA recipients. I mean, so there's some elements in this law that go beyond the premise of what everybody just saw when they read the first two lines.
Well, I think that, how do I say this? When it comes to 314, the Secure the Border Act, you would think that the single subject rule should apply. Let me give you this example. I'm for stopping fentanyl. Yes.
Who is
The
it?
Secure the Border Act with regard to the immigrant community, I do not support it for a variety of reasons. So how do I vote? And I really think that this issue that you just talked about wasn't about immigrants. It was about fentanyl. And whether we can study that is going to be very helpful, because the last thing I want to hear is that Latinos themselves are anti-immigrant. I don't believe they are. I think they're anti-fentanyl, no different than I was, but decided that that was more important than securing the border.
I think it's important to note, too, there wasn't an active campaign that was really run for this. And obviously the information environment that we all lived in during the election cycle was very conducive for 314 passing. When you talk to experts kind of across the board, whether it's in law enforcement, in the business community, I think very few people have hope that 314 is actually going to do anything to solve the problems that they've identified. If anything, it's going to just end up in, hundreds of millions of dollars of litigation, much like the legacy of SB 1070. But, I think from a voting perspective, there is a lot of frustration that exists within the electorate. I think about the disorder at the border and the recent kind of waves of migration, about fentanyl, about other things in our community that will probably do more to tell the story about why 314 passed. But unfortunately, those things are not going to be any better because Prop 314 passed. If anything, it's actually a distraction from real solutions to work on these issues.
Yeah, I've also read how 314 may never take effect, depending on what happens in the Texas appeal going on with SB 4, which it was modeled after. But then you also have the Trump promise, vow, campaigning about mass deportation, where 314 may not even be needed or part of the equation if we go with mass deportation nationwide, including in Arizona.
Well, first of all, my message has been to everybody, but particularly to the Latino communities and those who can be affected directly. don't worry about something happening tomorrow. Don't worry about something happening in the beginning of the year. In my opinion, this Secure the Border Act will not become effective on the day it's supposed to because, as you stated earlier, there is going to be litigation. And right now, the Supreme Court case on SB 1070 is very specific. On a 5-4 vote, and I can get into that later, on a 5-4 vote, that immigration is within the jurisdiction of the federal government and not the state government. That was 5 justices. 4 justices said, under the Constitution, if the federal government isn't taking care of a matter that the states need, then the states can take the prerogative to do so, okay? And so right now, for my immediate analysis, is that this 314 will not take effect. The courts will enjoin them. They have to follow the Supreme Court decision that's out there now. I doubt that any local federal judge is going to say, I disagree with the Supreme Court, but it's possible. That will still spur an appeal, and that appeal will more than likely involve an injunction. So you're either going to get an injunction up front at the federal court lower level or an injunction at the Court of Appeals level, because at the end of the day, we still have SB 1070, Arizona versus the U.S., that says that the jurisdiction for enforcing immigration laws is within the federal government. And that could take quite a while on top of millions of dollars, like he said. So I'm telling people, hold on. Second, let's just take the number 8 million, okay? As people who have been in this country for over 30 years, okay, who have mixed families, right? U.S. citizens, people who are here undocumented, legal residents, you get all these folks, right? And at the end of the day, how many can really be deported under those circumstances immediately? There is no capacity now to deal with the folks that they do have. Zero capacity. Things are behind. Hearings are being held, never being held. You bring in another million into this equation, totally undoable.
Yeah, not to mention the economic impact and so forth.
And frankly, I just don't think that that's what a majority of voters, especially even the voters who voted for 314, signed up for. I think a lot of the information environment that people were in was about some of the recent waves of migration and the way that some of those folks were characterized. Certainly during the campaign, the President Trump kind of highlighted things about the Haitian community in Ohio and that town in Ohio. I think as folks start to see the reality of a situation, they're going to have a lot of different feelings about it. And it's not to minimize the pain that could be caused by any actions that the Trump administration does take on this. But I certainly would caution, whether it's Republicans in the legislature in Arizona or the incoming administration, on actions they're looking to take, to be careful about where they think voters actually are on this issue. Because even though this felt like a very negative outcome for people who, care about immigration and its role in driving the American economy, as well as, folks who have mixed status families, ultimately, I don't think a majority of voters are really on board with as hateful of the rhetoric that was out there during this election cycle.
Well, let's go back to Latino voters in general. A young population, median age for Latinos in Arizona is about 26.
Correct. Yeah.
My age, Danny, 26. And for non-Latino whites, it's like 13 years older than that. So we have a young population. Every year, more and more Latinos turn 18, and they're almost all born here, so they're eligible to vote. Does this election give us any insight into the future of Latino voters? Are younger Latinos plugging in and getting involved, or are they still the elusive butterflies that we've yet to capture?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen continual progress every 2 years in terms of the Latino share of the electorate becoming more representative. Now, because exactly the point you mentioned, the median age is 26. I've always said if you want to predict the probability that somebody's going to turn out and vote, turn their age into a percentage, and it's about right. And it kind of doesn't matter whether it's Latinos or any other group in Arizona,
Yeah.
but you look at that age, it's a major predictor of whether people turn out and vote. And it has a lot to do just with, the priorities people have in life. And let's face it, like, I don't know about you, but like when I was 26, I did vote, but it wasn't the top of mind thing for me. It wasn't as important as it is to me today, kind of day to day. So, as the Latinos have come of age and started to enter the electorate, that has brought that gap that we have seen where Latinos weren't getting their representative share of the population into the electorate. And we're starting to see that reconcile. It's still very far behind, still has a lot of growth to occur. But as I mentioned, we're confident we're going to see in this election cycle over 600,000 Latinos in Arizona voting. In the midterm in 2022, we were over 400,000. Of course, there's a difference between midterm and presidential years, but that's very heartening that's going to be a record number of Latinos that turned out and voted. I suspect we're going to see another record number of Latinos in the next midterm election. And that's only a good thing, meaning that Latinos, the community, has their more closer to their representative share of their population within the election.
I think what's important to kind of agree with what he's saying is, my mom had a saying, no hay un mal porque bien no venga. And what it means is, though we have suffered some losses, we can learn from them and we can make good of them. And what can happen here is that Donald Trump and his supporters could overstep a boundary. Yes, we're against fentanyl. Yes, we need to control our borders. But no, you're not taking my aunt. And no, you're not taking my cousin. And no, damn it, and I'm going to see what I can do to make sure this doesn't happen. So I think the reaction, if they're not careful, could be in our favor to get more people registered to vote, especially amongst the young, because emotional issues tug at them more so than economic issues. And so I think we have to use this to our advantage, that they are going to overstep their bounds, and that our community has got to be ready, increase their voter registration, increase their voter turnout, so that people can understand that maybe we voted in favor of 314 for reasons other than deport my mother.
And I would add to that, we're in an age of extreme partisan polarization. Democrats vote for Democrats, Republicans vote for Republicans. And of course, we're a state also that a third of the electorate is independents. Well, young Latinos are registering, I won't say exclusively, but close to exclusively as independents. And I think this election demonstrates that this is a group that you have to campaign towards. So to your point about overreaching, that should be a caution sign to everybody that the Latino vote is perhaps the largest segment of persuadable votes in the electorate, especially in a closely contested swing state like Arizona. So, both parties should be careful about how they proceed and what they focus on, and making sure that they are delivering for that community when they're in power, because that more and more the Latino community is going to be responsible for driving who wins elections in Arizona and Nevada and Texas and a lot of other states.
Yeah, and the midterm is just 2 years away, and traditionally the party that's holds the White House and even the House and Senate in a midterm lose a lot of that power. Yeah. It's just kind of the checks and balances that the voter does. So there's a lot at play here. Mass deportations can certainly play a big role in the midterm election.
Overreaching.
So can if promises aren't kept. If gas and grocery prices don't come down, well, that's what you voted for. Well, then you hold the party in power as responsible. So there's a lot at play. Everybody thinks the election over. No, you know what happened? It's just the election began for 2026.
Yeah.
Agree.
Well, and it's hard to see the impact on gas prices, groceries, everything in our life being better if mass deportation is carried out. I think, especially in a state like Arizona, any deportation is a recipe for inflation, is a recipe for economic pain, not just for Latinos, but for everybody.
Yeah, again, then you're talking about not the color brown anymore. You're talking about the color green, right, which suddenly is a universal color that many people care about. Because if you notice on 314, you did not get businesses coming out and supporting that. They were pretty quiet.
Well, I think it was generally that way across the board. I mean, one of the things that I noticed, I mean, I was a part of the anti-SB 1070. When you talk about noise being made and marches and activism, and you compare it to what happened here recently with 314, somebody said to me, what's up, man? We're not seeing the same reaction here, right? And I think at the end of the day, it was coming to the conclusion, where do we spend our resources? Because clearly the polls showed that 314 was going to win, and people just figured, let's move on to the next issue, whatever that is. And so, especially amongst young people, I just didn't see the anger in our community because it was mixed in with so much more, the economy, fentanyl, and things of that nature, whereas SB 1070 was directly aimed at our immigrant community and the potential for the deportations that we think are going to be overreaching if they happen this time.
Yeah, definitely. It's it's to be determined. We shall see what is happening with this. Certainly could be a game changer. DJ, you got your laptop open. What numbers are jumping out to you that really kind of tell a story that perhaps we're missing, or something that underscores a point that we're making?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned before the CNN exit polls are kind of like the initial snapshot that we get. Actually, before we actually start seeing election results on election day, we get the snapshot of the election from the exit polls. This is a survey done of voters, about 1,800 supposedly representative voters across Arizona. When you drill down to just Latinos, like I mentioned, Vice President Harris got about 55% of the Latino vote. Congressman Gallego got about 61%. Look, those numbers, we got to, drill down a little bit further to kind of see if they're accurate. As I mentioned, UCLA did some precinct analysis that suggested that Vice President Harris actually got over 60% of the vote across the state. I tend to believe that number when I look at the precinct results so far. And we can do regression analysis to kind of look at the census statistics in each of these precincts and kind of determine how each group kind of voted relatively overall. But it still suggests, like I said, a diminishment of the vote from 2020 with President Biden. Whether the big question to me is whether it was a 3 or 4% underperformance or whether it was like a 6 or 7% underperformance. I think, like often in life, the truth is probably somewhere in between. It still represents a pretty substantial shift and is part of the story. I think in Arizona and probably in a lot of places, especially in the Rust Belt, when we look at the presidential race, the story might actually be more something that's been occurring over the last several election cycles and certainly showed up in Arizona's exit polls. When you look at educational attainment as a factor, white voters in the presidential race, white voters with a college degree, 52% Harris, 47% Trump. Non-college whites, 36% Harris, 64% Trump.
Yeah.
When you look at voters of color, same split, almost exactly the same. 55 Harris, 42 Trump with a college degree, 54-43 without a college degree. That's all voters of color combined. So, non-college whites, particularly in rural Arizona and rural places across the country, we've seen Democrats just not competing the same for those what folks often call working class voters, although it kind of always bugs me because Latinos and blacks and everybody else are working class too. But certainly, that is a trend line we've seen diminish. It was only a few election cycles ago that Democrats were competing for a majority of non-college whites.
I have a question for you. I've always been interested, from a religious standpoint, the Latino community is very connected to church, right. Whether it be Catholic or evangelical or whatnot. Are there going to be any indicators or studies to show what impact the reproductive rights issue had in our community in terms of how they voted? Because I don't know that I've heard anything. What do you think?
Yeah, it's something that we've looked at a lot in survey research, and certainly it's a dynamic we've started to look at in the exit polls. Obviously, Proposition 139, which was to enshrine abortion rights into the Arizona Constitution, did very, very well. Kind of outperformed everything else on the ballot. And there's been a lot of Certainly the number one question I get from reporters in the days since the election is, how did Prop 139 do so well, but Vice President Harris and other Democrats didn't do as well? And I think that voters are more complicated than we give them credit for. Clearly, a close to supermajority of Arizonans support abortion rights in some way, including enshrining a very close to Roe-like standard in our Arizona Constitution, and certainly even a higher percentage of Latinos, close to a supermajority, did support Proposition 139 as well. So it's complicated. I think Latinos have a complicated relationship with issues like this, but I think what's clear is they don't think it gets better when you put the government in between the decision making for a woman and her doctor, being in any part involved in that. And I could tell an anecdote from my own family members that support Prop 139 but may not call themselves pro-abortion. They look at cases in Latin American countries, particularly Mexico and other places, and say, hey, there's instances where women have had miscarriages, had medical issues, ended up in jail because the government has gotten involved in those places. And so regardless of their personal or moral feelings on the issue, understand that, this is an issue that really doesn't belong in government. So I think it's complicated. We haven't seen a strong correlation that it's tied to, the vote at the top of the ticket, for instance, this kind of being in the discourse. I do think that, we're going to start to see the economy being just a major sport. So I guess there is an open question whether, talking about certain issues at the expense of others plays a role. Maybe not talking about the economy quite enough. But I certainly don't see evidence, that it's, the discourse around abortion is driving down the Latino vote. If anything, quite the opposite, especially with young Latinos.
Yeah, and with the abortion issue, you did not have to vote for one candidate or the other to have your view supported on abortion because it was a separate ballot proposition. So that removed it from that equation where I need to vote this person because either you're pro or against. No. Vote how you want, and then you can vote on this issue separately.
Yeah.
Just want to wrap it up. We could talk all day. Interesting conversations, but any final thoughts Danny, that you might have with Latino vote or the state of Latino vote? Where are we? What do you think? Where are we today? Where are we tomorrow?
Well, first of all, I think we're in a very good position to continue to exercise our influence. It didn't go for some of us the way we had wished, but what's important is that the Latino vote is increasing, that they're registering to vote and getting out to vote, whether we agree or disagree on whatever issues or candidates, that people are getting out to vote. And I think that that's the number one thing that came from this. Number two is that that candidates, irrespective of background or race, are paying attention to us in a way that's very, very meaningful. For me, politically, I would have liked to have seen it more on one side than the other, but this is a maturation of the Latino vote in a way that respects our community and all its views.
Yeah, I would just echo that it's only a good thing that Latinos are participating in higher rates and have a bigger say in the outcome of our country. I will also say, looking at these election results, starting to kind of analyze and think about what's gone down in our country over the last several election cycles, I think it's more and more important that we are having conversations with our friends, with our neighbors, with our family members, discussing issues, because more and more we are getting into our own information silos, including Latinos. And, if we embrace regardless of whether, folks are oriented with the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, or independent, if we're embracing the politics of separation and not of addition, then we're only going to get further into those information silos. And that's just the nature of social media and news. And, there's a lot of people that want to, push a more extreme agenda, but it's a lot harder to do when you're face to face and having to acknowledge each other's humanity. And I think, this applies to Latinos more than anybody. I think this is a community that is up for grabs. Their votes are up for grabs. they care about the same things that everybody else does. And, ultimately we need to have real conversations with voters and break through, because, otherwise we're going to be getting all of our information off TikTok or Instagram or other things. And Latinos are impacted more so than everybody else by economic pain that's felt in the community. And so, we just need to kind of listen to what voters are saying to us.
A little bit of advice for families at Thanksgiving and Christmas. Leave politics aside. Embrace your brothers and sisters. Embrace your primos, your tios, and your tias.
Right. Talk about how poorly the Cowboys are doing. That's always a good one for Thanksgiving dinner. Yeah, it's universal. I want to thank you both, but I also want to give a special shout out to Danny Ortega, who is a board member on CPLC Action Fund, CISA, who helped make this possible, not only through his leadership, but also through a generous financial contribution to help underwrite these podcasts, which I think were so important early on and will continue to be for getting out the word on what does it mean, Latino Loud, what does a Latino vote mean? And it's about political empowerment, regardless of where you are on the partisan scale. It is about Latinos being heard, because that's the best way to address issues that are important to our community. But thank you both.
Thank you.
Joe Garcia, thank you very much for joining us. And until the next podcast of Latino Loud, Latino Proud, thank you.